But first I'd like to describe the WGA Species Conservation and ESA Initiative and go over a few logistical details for today's webinar. The WGA Species Conservation and ESA Initiative started in 2015 as the Chairman's Initiative of Governor Mead of Wyoming. The initiative envisioned a framework for states and stakeholders to share best practices in species management, to promote and elevate the role of states in species conservation efforts, and finally to explore ways to improve the efficacy of the ESA. The initiative has involved an examination of the ESA to determine what's working and what isn't, but the effort has also gone well beyond consideration of just ESA and also looked to examine innovations related to species management and species conservation and consider means by which state, federal, and private resources can be better leveraged in conservation. Over the 3 years of the initiative, thoughtful discussions conducted through webinars, workshops, and work sessions have led to the development of a WGA policy resolution on species conservation in the ESA, and also a set of detailed recommendations to improve the implementation of the Act and improve species conservation efforts. But the adoption of those recommendations and the resolution is not the end of our work by any means. This webinar serves as the second in a series of third-year efforts of the initiative, and now we turn our focus to a timely examination of funding and proactive voluntary conservation, a topic of critical concern and a timely topic of critical concern for all stakeholders and wildlife managers. I'm hopeful that this webinar will serve as a building block in what continues to be a series of many meaningful dialogues conducted on the issue by WGA. A few quick logistics, and then I'll turn things over to our moderator, Chris West, Rocky Mountain Regional Director of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. I'll let him introduce the panelists in just a moment, but first some logistics. Each panelist will deliver brief opening remarks. Following those remarks, Chris will then ask a few questions of the panelists and will engage in a moderated discussion. Following that moderated discussion amongst all panelists, we'll begin a question and answer session open to all attendees. All attendees are currently on mute, so you will need to write your questions into the chat box. The Q&A box and a chat box, we would prefer that you write the questions into the chat box. That's on the bottom right of the screen, and be sure that you have selected the option to address your chat question directly to Kevin Moss. He's listed as one of the panelists. He'll be fielding the Q&A questions. We are recording this webinar, and our goal is to have a recording of the webinar available probably by early next week. And so with all of that housekeeping being said, I will now turn things over to the moderator, Chris.
Thanks, Zach. I'm Chris West, Rocky Mountain Regional Director for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We're a national nonprofit organization that convenes public and private partners around the nation's most pressing conservation needs. Today we're going to be joined by hopefully 5 different panelists. We are working on connectivity on our 5th panelist, but hope that will be that will all work out. Joining us today we have Myles Culhane, who's Assistant General Counsel for Occidental Petroleum Corporation. Debbie Hughes is the Executive Director of the New Mexico Association of Conservation Districts. Nick Owens, Senior Health, Safety and Environment Representative from Anadarko Petroleum. Javier Montoya, New Mexico State Conservationist for the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And Ross Melinchuk, Deputy Executive Director, Natural Resources, Texas Department of Parks and Wildlife. So we'll go to the next slide here. Just a really quick overview of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and our role as a convener in the Pecos Watershed Conservation Initiative. Really, our role here is to provide a platform for partnerships to evolve. And as I mentioned, we work with both federal and non-federal partners, private and public partnerships to address the nation's most pressing conservation needs through this convening function. I'm going over a couple slides here. Yeah. And I'm going to let most of the details of the Pecos Watershed Conservation Initiative get brought up by our private and public partners that are involved. But in short, the initiative was formally launched in November 2017 and represents partnerships between the at this point, six oil and natural gas companies, the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service in both New Mexico and Texas, as well as from their nationwide office through the Resource Conservation Protection Program. and then also working closely with both the state game and fish agencies in New Mexico and Texas. The last component of the partnership will involve significant participation from the nonprofit sector through our grant making. Initial program priorities, which we'll touch on in some more detail, include conservation of stream and riparian habitat, grassland restoration and management, and outreach and information gathering to address those two goals listed above. At this point, our effort is brand new. Like I said, this is about its third or fourth month of existence. So some of the outcomes have yet to be entirely determined, but the partners are working closely with each other and with the foundation to develop a business plan for the program that will really address not only the outcomes desired, but the specific conservation actions and the expected outcomes to be measured over the life of the plan, which will probably be a 10-year planning horizon. You can go to the last slide here. And just before I turn it over, these are the current funding partners in this program. The 6 oil and natural gas companies are listed there on the left, as well as NRCS down below. NIFW, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, is known as NIFWIP. We may hear that referred to several times throughout the webinar today. We are thrilled to really serve in this convening and role and be the entity where a partnership like this is allowed to develop. And I think each of our partners are going to get into some detail on why they see value in joining into this partnership, and something that's a little bit new in terms of how and the scale, how it came together, the scale and scope of what it is working to address, and also working in a landscape that in many ways is, from a conservation perspective, has been an underappreciated landscape for a long time. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to each of our panelists for about a 5-minute introduction. We're going to run through some slides as they talk, but I'm going to start with Debbie Hughes from the New Mexico Association of Conservation Districts.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Yes, I've been the executive director here in New Mexico for over 23 years, working with private landowners and specifically Natural Resource Conservation Service, as well as BLM and a lot of other state and federal agencies. You can go to the next slide. We just want to give a tiny bit of history. We started some work here in the early 1990s. Keep clicking on it and it'll show some other things. But we started working on 3 rivers, including the Pecos River. If you click a couple times, it'll show some pictures. There you go. And I wanted this picture on there. Go back, please, because this bottom one is actually the Delaware River, and you couldn't even tell there was a river there, and it wasn't flowing year-round. And actually, the Bureau of Land Management did this one primarily, and since then, the Delaware has been flowing, and it's been a great partnership. But so we had this money came from the state legislature, and then in about 2003, you can go ahead with the next one. We got there was an earmark where NRCS had to put some of this money on federal land. So it brought us together, and BLM actually said, we'll match dollar for dollar, and they wanted to focus in southeast New Mexico. So we started doing a lot of work for lizard, the dune lizard and the prairie chicken on their habitat. And so we got a grant actually from BLM and started doing some bigger work. But on each ranch, we had a coordinated resource management plan, so that we did work individually, even though it was a landscape scale approach. So go ahead with the slides. What we said was we wanted to be colorblind. We worked across everybody's boundaries, private, state, federal, it didn't matter. And that's what has made it so successful in doing these landscape scale. And you can see, you know, just from the pictures, one on the left and then going to what it looks like on the right when we get this done. So go ahead to the next slide. Next slide, please. All right, and you're going to have to keep clicking on some of these too, because what I'm showing you also is some before and after pictures, but I want to point out the amazing results that we've been able to get with this program, coordinating, leveraging dollars from private landowners, from NRCS, and from the Bureau of Land Management, as well as a lot of other partners. Keep going with the slides, please. So we started with the local soil and water conservations because they're political subdivisions. They have access to do like price agreements where we could work among several areas at once. Aerial application treatments have been what's gotten, we've been able to do it cheaper, more effectively doing the large scale projects. Go ahead, please, the slide. But we also did some work with oil and gas companies in the early days, helping to restore some of the old abandoned oil field sites and removing the caliche and putting that caliche on the roads or deep burying it. And this was to bring together the land where we didn't have these wide open spaces where the prairie chickens could all be attacked. But we had to use private money for that because it didn't fit in Farm Bill programs. But we did do quite a bit of that. And so we're really excited to move on to this next step. We have been able to handle grants from the Bureau of Land Management totaling right at $50 million for the last 13 years. Go ahead. That's just one of the pads that we reclaimed. And this just talks about the grants again. The grants were each for 5 years. We're now on the last $20 million grant. I'm not sure that same level of federal money is going to keep coming. So we're, I'm really glad that the private corporations are coming in, but we do still have money still flowing from USDA NRCS. Go ahead, please. Put the slides. So just a slide here to show you that we have worked on over 3.3 million acres here in New Mexico in our partnership, and that's because we have leveraged so much money with private, state, and federal and put it together and done some large-scale projects in the past. Go ahead. Slide, please. There's approximately how much money, over $69 million, in what we call Restore New Mexico has been put on the ground. But, of course, all of it hasn't been done in the Pecos area, and we still have more work to do there. Go ahead, please. So we're really excited. We still have money flowing from USDA. We got a grant for $7 million that can be spent on branches with federal land. So a lot of those there on the Pecos area will qualify for some of this $7 million, which is going to be great to leverage and match to other private money that we have coming. Go ahead. The slide, please. This one is just to show you the capacity of our state association. We're also working in other areas. This is actually more in the, well, it's all over the state, but it's with acequias. And that's been very successful with over $7 million just the last three years. Go ahead, please. And we are still working on another river, and this is also just to kind of show you some of what we've done. We've been getting Water Trust Board money, Game and Fish Department, as well as the RCPPs on the Canadian River, doing specific riparian work, just like the additional work we need to do on the Pecos River, and this has been to benefit a lot of the lesser prairie chicken habitat. Go ahead, please. Yeah, just to show you with this new program, which is Regional Conservation Partnership Program, we've been very successful here in New Mexico. We've been able to get over $31 million just in the last 3 years for some of that you just saw, and we're real excited about getting to have some new partners. You can go ahead with the slide. We feel like we do have the capacity to get funding on the ground. We have the relationships with the landowners. We have over 50-plus contractors that are for technical assistance that we utilize part-time. A lot of those are retired NRCS and retired BLM folks. And then we also have Jesse Juan working for us, with us, former BLM director for New Mexico. He's going to be the lead on our this Pecos project, and he's actually been down on the Pecos the last 3 days talking to landowners and looking at the resource needs. And I know Jesse's on this call too, so hopefully he can help answer any questions. And that's all I had for now, so I'd be glad to try to answer questions here in a little bit. But we are very concerned about the Texas hornshell mussel. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. I'm going to turn it over. Javier Montoya doesn't look like he's going to be able to join us and do a presentation, but we can fill in as we can. Do you make it on? No, he hasn't been on. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Myles Culhane. Myles is with Occidental Petroleum, and really, I think there's a nice. Debbie teed this up for you in terms of looking at species and some of the things that brought Occidental to the table as a part of this partnership and a leader in the effort. So, Myles, take it away.
Thank you, Chris, and I'd like to thank Zach and the WGA. The WGA's initiative and their work on this in this arena has actually been a critical component of Oxy's evolving approach towards its interaction with the landscape and its conservation initiatives. They've helped facilitate the initial conversations that we had with NIFWIP about the opportunities down here to do some positive conservation work in the Pecos. So again, I do appreciate it, and at least with regards to this initiative, it's been extremely valuable. Could you switch to the next slide, please? I just want to give everyone a little background. Oxy does not refine or sell gasoline directly to the consumer, so oftentimes we're not a company that's real familiar to the consumer in the general public, but we're one of the largest operators and largest producers of oil and gas and a leading acreage holder in the Permian Basin, which is in West Texas and Southeast New Mexico. We use a great deal of carbon dioxide for enhanced oil recovery, and we're now working on a number of initiatives to actually sequester that carbon dioxide and provide for long-term sequestration of that to help further reduce the carbon footprint of our operations and others for taking anthropogenic CO2 and sequestering it. We also have operations. Dolphin Project is in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, and we're the largest oil producer in Oman and the second largest producer offshore in Qatar. So that's a little bit about who we are. Can we go to the next slide? As Oxy, we're an international corporation, and we strive to incorporate several different approaches into our operations, and one of them that we've been working on for the last few years is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and we've worked that into the social responsibility programs that we operate. And one of those social responsibility programs focuses on environmental stewardship, and part of that process is that we're going to work and apply a relatively robust environmental risk management approach to our operational practices. That includes compliance, obviously, with environmental laws, but one of the important aspects of that I happen to work on is the preservation of habitat and biodiversity. Next slide, please. So we've got more than 2 decades of experience working with habitat and biodiversity issues, and actually that was true 6 years ago. At some point I'm going to have to say we've got almost 3 decades of experience. This is just a little footprint of the different initiatives we're working on in this region right now. Could we go to the next slide? That's a broad overview. We blow it up, this little, and I apologize for the fuzziness, but this little area of green, yellow, red, and orange is the habitat of the dune sagebrush lizard in Texas. And so we are working the issues associated with the dune sagebrush lizard and have been doing so for some time. We're members of the Texas Conservation Program on the Texas side, and then also members of the Centers for Excellence in Hazardous Material Management Program for the lizard and the lesser prairie chicken on the New Mexico side. Next slide, please. The largest initiative we've got working prior to this Pecos one were the lesser prairie chicken. These sort of amorphous blobs are a rough rendering of the lesser prairie chicken habitat that extends through Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Texas, and New Mexico. So we've been very active in initiatives trying to benefit this bird, this particular species, throughout this region. Next slide, please. This morning, the Fish and Wildlife Service provided us an advanced copy of a listing decision on the Texas hornshell mussel. That's this little chunk of property down here. And that advanced copy indicates that they intend to propose to list this mussel as endangered tomorrow. This is somewhat the real heart of the formation of the Pecos Watershed Initiative. We were looking at this lizard and the issues with its habitat and how we we're addressing it, as well as our experiences working on a species-by-species approach to conservation. And we're realizing that there are larger issues here than just a single species, and there are certain inefficiencies with working on a species-by-species approach. So we started having these discussions internally about a landscape approach, and part of those discussions led to conversations with NIFWF on what we might be able to do on a landscape level. How would we define that landscape? Would it be something as small as this little block here for the Texas hornshell mussel, or would it be something broader? Could you switch to the next slide, please? So we sought a new approach, really, and we wanted to change our focus to stop focusing on a species-by-species effort, which because of the time frame and involved in getting conservation agreements agreed to, was a time-intensive process and was increasingly failing to unlock funding that we think is available out there in the landscape to put some real good conservation on the ground. So we switched our focus to a landscape level approach. We started looking for creative solutions to some of the funding challenges. We understand from our experience working with property owners, particularly on the Texas side, that there's always a little bit of reticence to get involved in programs that have a federal permitting regime attached to them. And so we were trying to look for ways to get around that. And as we thought about that, we started thinking, what are our core values? Do our core values align with those sustainable development goals that we seek to align our corporation with? And so we started thinking what's important here is that we have the values that we understand the values of the communities within which we operate. Those values include a desire to have clean air, clean water, recreational opportunities for their children, good school systems, they want good roads, they want economic development. We share those same values, and those are our core values. So when we think about that, it becomes less about the regulatory assurances that are provided through the various permitting mechanisms under Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act, and more about, can we maximize conservation on the ground? And in addition, we started thinking about this investment we make as the same as the investments we make in our oil field development, which is that if we're going to make an investment in conservation, we're going to seek a return on that investment in the form of positive conservation results. And so with this mindset in mind, can we switch to the next slide, please? We work closely with NIFWF and our other industry partners, and in discussions with representatives from New Mexico and Texas on what an initiative would look like, a broader initiative to look at the landscape. How do we define this landscape? What are the boundaries of that landscape? And we wound up taking a look at what we call the Pecos Watershed. So its nexus with our operations in the Permian is important. Its nexus with our employee base in the Permian is extremely important, but it's also an extremely important water body through, again, and I echo Chris West's words, through what we think of as an underappreciated landscape, but a very important landscape in the United States from an energy production standpoint. So we eventually defined it as this broad area, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means as we go on. But can we go to the next slide, please? So we think the Pecos Watershed Conservation Initiative that we've worked to develop with our corporate partners like Anadarko aligns well with our core values. And the basic concepts are that Occidental cares about its relationships with the Permian, the people, the communities, and the environment of the Permian. And in turn, those communities believe that companies like Oxy can provide responsible economic development that will benefit their community while minimizing their environmental impact. In addition, our shareholders care about our commitment to the Permian and our other operations throughout the world and sustainable operations that we have. They ask us about those. We have initiatives from shareholder groups that ask us to reduce our environmental footprint. Every year we are asked to respond to those initiatives and show that we are improving and thinking about and taking into consideration the risks, the environmental risks of our operations, and we are being responsive to that. in addition, being able to work with NIFWF is provided us an opportunity to work with what we think of as a very credible organization, and one that has a great deal of experience in working on these sorts of partnerships and helping us unlock some of the funding opportunities that are out there. Because NIFWF has a history and the experience of securing matching funds. And yes, at the end of the day, we do hope that the positive conservation outcomes that will result from this initiative and the other initiatives that Debbie was talking about will help to inform the regulatory decisions made pursuant to the ESA. And so with that, I'll turn it over to the next presenter, and I'm going to be happy to answer any questions as well once we get to that point.
Thank you, Myles. I'm going to hand it over to Nick Owens from Anadarko Petroleum. Nick and Myles have been instrumental in developing the partnership, and that has led to this initiative. And Nick, I'll just turn it over to you to add in Anadarko's perspective on how this came to be and why you're a part of it.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Chris, and special thanks to Zach and the Western Governors Association for their continued focus and dialogue around the Endangered Species Act and conservation. As Chris mentioned, my name is Nick Owens. I'm a senior HSE representative with Anadarko. I'm a biologist by background and work across our entire global footprint on really a whole cadre of exciting environmental media-related issues, be it spearheading Anadarko's participation in the Pecos program that we'll talk about today, or managing our company's Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services program for our Mozambique liquid natural gas development, which is one of the world's largest LNG projects. I'm very excited, however, today to talk about our efforts in conservation and the unique value proposition that comes from the partnership that we have with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, as well as the collective talents of the partners participating in this initiative. Next slide, please. So for those listening in that might not be familiar with Anadarko, we are among the world's largest independent oil and natural gas exploration and production companies. We have a portfolio of assets encompassing premier positions in major U.S. onshore shale and resource plays, as well as oil-focused opportunities in deep water basins worldwide, which is shown here on this map. Next slide, please. Specific to today's discussion, Anadarko's top-tier position in Texas' Permian Basin will truly drive material growth for our company, with nearly 10,000 drilling locations identified, equating to some 4 billion barrels of oil equivalent of net resources. Next slide, please. As we look at this emerging play in the Permian that is so important to not only Anadarko, but also our industry as a whole, the Pecos Watershed Initiative really made a lot of sense. Here we have an opportunity to build tomorrow's oil and natural gas development, integrating a conservation program hand in hand with state and federal agencies, conservation groups, and other industry partners, not because we have to, not because of any regulatory requirements, but rather because it's the right thing for us to do as stewards of the environment. It's important to note that Anadarko is no stranger to conservation. Whether we are funding research projects with academia to understand how our operations may impact habitats or species, being recently recognized as Research Partner of the Year with the University of Wyoming, or developing our own peer-reviewed science to help quantify how technological advancements with horizontal drilling are driving lower habitat disturbance, we've really made it a habit to build in a conservation mindset to our business. Paramount to Anadarko is our ability to maintain our social license to operate. And this program provides a great platform for us to invest in the local communities through a focused conservation effort that takes a landscape scale approach to moving the bar for species and habitats. The structure and mechanics of the program really were compelling for Anadarko, as NIFWF is required to provide measurable outcomes, meaning we can ensure that the impact of our dollars, while not only being multiplied by NIFWF, has the beneficial outcomes for habitats and species that we set out to create. We're taking a targeted approach to really driving value across this landscape and have identified a suite of focal species that will help us define the success of the program. Having been involved now for some time on issues associated with the Endangered Species Act, this program has the dual benefit of hopefully helping to keep a number of these species from requiring additional protection under the ESA, For many years now, conservation has come really one species at a time, not recognizing that species do not exist in isolation, but rather function together on a larger scale. So by taking this holistic approach to conservation in the Chihuahuan Desert ecoregion, we really hope to drive value at a scale that matters to species and their habitats. Lastly, I wanted to highlight that all of this is happening with the backdrop of low commodity prices, as we are hopefully exiting the prolonged downturn in the oil and gas industry that we've lived with over the past number of years. Access to capital is difficult in down times like we're in, and I couldn't be more proud to work at a company like Anadarko that really understands the value of initiatives like this and is committed to living our core values and maintaining high standards for health, safety, as well as the environment. I'll turn it over back to you, the last person.
All right, thank you, Nick. Next, I'm going to bring in Ross Melinchuk from the Texas Department of Parks and Wildlife. And Ross, from a state perspective, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Chris, and good morning, everybody. I also want to thank Zach Bodine and the Western Governors Association for arranging this webinar. Next slide, please. This slide, you've seen parts of this in other presentations, but it really shows the stark contrast in land ownership patterns between Texas and New Mexico, with a preponderance of private land in the Texas portion of the Pecos Watershed. This, of course, presents some unique challenges and opportunities for the Texas partners working in this landscape. Next slide, please. These blue polygons on this map represent Texas Parks and Wildlife's priority desert grasslands, both within and outside of the Pecos and Delaware watersheds. Next slide, please. These grassland areas generally correspond to our pronghorn herd units, for instance, in this very landscape. So we're using a holistic approach here to managing species here in Texas. Next slide, please. We've also done the same thing for our native fish species. We've mapped, prioritized, next slide, or next click, please. Yeah, we've prioritized native fish conservation areas in this same geography. So we know what sort of what the priorities are, where we can focus a more holistic approach here to managing not just the streams and riparian areas, but the corresponding uplands that go along with it. Next slide, please. Here on the right, you can see some of the river and streams where over the years we've done surveys, habitat restoration, and even some fish reintroductions. For example, the silvery minnow reintroductions on the Rio Grande and some of the habitat suitability studies we're currently involved in for Rio Grande chub on McKittrick Creek, and are just a couple of examples. Next slide, please. Snowstorm. Can we get another slide? Okay.
Okay, we're working on it. Is it on there now?
Back one, please.
Oh, apparently that slide might be a little too big for the system, Ross.
Okay. Well, this slide is the Devil's River, which arguably is one of the most pristine rivers in the entire southwestern United States, and we've been working on the Devil's River intensively for a decade now, taking that very same approach that's being outlined here in the Pecos River Initiative, but this whole landscape or holistic approach to aquatic and terrestrial resource management really seems to be generating some not only resource benefits but community benefits, which we're all very interested in too. Next slide, please. Just a couple of examples. You know, we've been conducting habitat mapping on the Devil's River to support these habitat suitability models for species like Devil's River minnow, the Texas hornshell, next slide please, and other focal species the goal is really to link these groundwater levels to spring discharge, which then relate to river flows and the creation of suitable habitat. So it's kind of all connected, but having done some of this work in the past, we think we've got the combination to make this work. Next slide, please. Looks like we skipped one, but again, let me catch up to you here. You know, some of the landowner outreach and community service projects, including river cleanup, have been undertaken here that really generate landowner and community buy-in, acceptance, their engagement, and ultimately their support for this kind of work. Next slide, please. The Devils offers some excellent fishing, very important and highly sought after recreational fishery here. This has really prompted Texas Parks and Wildlife to introduce, you know, catch and release regulations along the river, and even to limit river use through day use permits, just to preserve the pristine nature of this, so we don't ultimately love it to death, but it's really a unique area. Next slide, please. Here's a couple more slides just giving you some examples of some of the ongoing work in the region, habitat restoration at Terlingua Creek, and more of this same kind of work would be undertaken with funding provided through the Pecos River Initiative. Next slide, please. Again, you know, replanting cottonwoods and you know, providing habitat, stream habitat for some of these imperiled fish species, that all leads to increased water conservation, sediment reduction, and so on. Next slide, please. These are just some of the examples of the cottonwood plantings along the riparian areas. Next slide. Again, some examples of some of the other places that we're working on in this Chihuahuan Desert ecoregion of Texas. Next slide. This is a list of some of the partners that have, the ongoing partnerships that have been actively working together in this desert ecoregion. And it's really based on our experience and that of the other panelists. Next slide. That we think this collaborative, proactive, landscape-level approach to conservation and land stewardship can prevent the need to list or highly regulate some of these currently imperiled species like lesser prairie chickens, grassland birds, up and down the flyway, and dune sagebrush lizard, just to name a few. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to just do some panel discussions. I really appreciate everybody giving us, staying on time and giving us plenty of time to have a little bit of back and forth here this morning. Let's maybe start with a question for Debbie, but I think I'll let others answer this as well. But from your perspective, Debbie, you've been active in this landscape now for well over a decade and a lot of experience, as does Ross, obviously, in Texas. But do you think that this new model of proactive and partnership-driven conservation versus the single species or random acts, and that's probably not an entirely fair way of saying it, but really looking at things at this landscape level and multiple species, do you think this will help all parties to better anticipate and address future conservation challenges in the region?
Oh yes, definitely. It's definitely the best way, and we'll be able to leverage a lot more dollars, but also see that we all get our return on the investment. And in the Restore New Mexico program, what we've said from the beginning is if we don't care who gets the credit, we all take credit, and we do a great job of telling our story. And so I'm really anxious to be able to work on this as a whole species, holistic watershed approach as opposed to trying to do something with single species, which was crazy. So very excited about it. This is definitely the best way.
Chris, this is Nick. I just would add in, I think when you take a broad approach over an area as expansive as what we're tackling here, you still have the risk of having a random act of conservation approach. But I think what we're doing, however, is pretty exciting, is we're bringing so many partners together through this initiative. And it becomes really this all for one and one for all approach, which, you know, I can only imagine will grow over time. And I think if we're successful here, this really helps to mitigate those future conservation challenges in the region.
And this is Myles. You know, just to add on there, I think that even going through this process, at least from Oxy's perspective, we have learned a great deal about others that have been working in this landscape like Debbie for many, many years. And part of that is through the power and the experience that NIPWIP brings to the table. Their contacts and their ability to reach out to other partners that we have not historically worked with helps to really unlock opportunities for us to do work in what is really a vast landscape out there, but also helps to unlock funding opportunities to provide for that conservation.
Right. Well, I'm going to maybe stick with Myles, with you and Nick for this next question, and really it's kind of focused, and I think you touched on it in part, but I really want to talk about from a business planning perspective. Obviously both companies clearly have a long-range view, are making significant investments in the energy, you know, and developing the energy resources of the Permian. But does participating in this allow you more freedom to operate or provide more operational certainty or reduce operational risk, in your view, going forward over the next, say, 10 to 20 years of development in the region?
Well, from Occidental's perspective, it definitely does. This is an extremely important part of our business planning, and it has definitely evolved over time, but to one that has to take a look at the larger landscape, because we're operating in many different areas of the Permian Basin and around the world, and our understanding of the landscape and the places where we're operating is growing all the time. As our need for relationships with the communities and the landowners, whether they're public lands or private lands, those relationships are extremely important. So through our work on a species-by-species approach over the past few decades, we've been learning that you have to keep those contacts with the property owners. You have to maintain them. You have to be a credible partner, particularly, I think, in the West. There is a lot of skepticism and misconceptions about what it means to be involved in a conservation effort. There's, I think, a genuine concern that the Endangered Species Act represents some sort of difficult regulatory challenge that could result in some federal control over your property. And so we have found over the decades that we have to really get to learn and know and understand the issues for the individual landowners on the ground and how they manage the landscape and how they feel about the landscape. And so they look at it as a landscape level issue and not as a species by species issue. And so we need to look at it that way. And for Oxy, this really provides us a greater degree of certainty, because we're able to show that we understand these issues, we work these issues, we've got experience working these issues, and that helps to mitigate some of the risks that would otherwise be present in focusing our operations on a basin like the Permian.
Chris, this is Nick. I would echo, Myles' comments. I think really for Anadarko, the credible partnership that is created through this really is a huge value add. As we look at, as an industry, how we've approached conservation in the past, a lot of the great things that we do are not always seen or very visible or even able to be quantified in the Fish and Wildlife Services peace process, for example. But what we see with this effort is a way to have a lot more visibility to the conservation actions that is put out in a way that's easily quantifiable and has that visibility to the regulatory agencies such as Fish and Wildlife Service. And so, hopefully by taking this larger view of the ecosystems we operate in and putting our money to work on the ground in a targeted and impactful way, the result will be a less fluid regulatory environment with less potential species listings in the future. I'm just tremendously excited about what this program and the opportunity set brings for having lasting and impactful conservation.
Thanks, Nick. I'm going to direct the next one to Ross. Unfortunately, Javier had to drop off. There's ongoing planning for a potential federal shutdown that he had to attend to. So, Ross, this gets to go to you. Just really, what has your role been so far at the state with the state agency perspective in the development of the initiative, and does your experience differ in any way from your initial expectations when you first came into this, and really what sets, if anything, what sets this effort apart in your view?
Well, yeah, certainly. I think you saw from my brief slides there that Parks and Wildlife has been operating in this landscape for a long time, our role here is really as a catalyst and a convener. There's a lot of partners, a lot of interest out here, both from the state, the federal, and the private NGO side of things, not to mention the landowners. Landowners in this part of the world don't own hundreds of acres. As a general rule, that they are managing thousands of acres, and water is such a critical part of their ranch operations. We have enjoyed the benefit of really having worked with these landowners for years. They're very accustomed to these partnerships with the oil and gas industry, and I think they're pleasantly surprised to hear that they're now partners here in taking on a landscape level conservation action. So combined with the work of our private lands biologists, our game wardens, and other staff here, we really think that we are able to bring these partnerships together, some of them rather unorthodox partnerships, to bring focus on this more landscape collaborative approach to conservation. We can't just focus on one species in one stretch of the river. We've got to be thinking about the whole there and how that impacts it. So, in answer to the second question you had, I think was about, was I surprised, or does this differ in any way than what I thought? I think I'm very pleasantly surprised to see the rapid buildup of momentum and support for this. As you saw, there's tens of partners who are very willing, able, and interested to join with us to help affect this landscape level approach to conservation. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ross. If any of the other panelists would like to jump in on that, feel free.
Well, I'm going to jump in. This is Myles with Occidental again. And certainly, I know there's a number of attendees on the call, and love to hear from them. But Oxy started working with Ross and the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department some years ago on the dune sagebrush lizard, and then really on the lesser prairie chicken initiative. And it's those types of relationships that took some time to build, certainly, but those types of relationships have value that resonate for Oxy throughout this process, because again, Ross Melinchuk with Texas Parks, as well as Carter and Smith and Clayton Wolf, were real strong partners, really understood what we were doing. They're people that we could see and talk to, get on the phone very easily with, and folks like Alexis Sandoval in New Mexico are the same way. And so those relationships that we built through decades of working on other initiatives and really informed our approach here to the Pecos Watershed Initiative, because we knew we would have credible partners, we knew we would have reliable partners, we knew we would have people that followed through on what they said they would do, and that helps to give Oxy comfort that its work in this area is going to reap results.
Chris, this is Ross again. Can I just add to Myles' comment?
Absolutely.
You know, Javier, who is the state conservationist with NRCS in New Mexico, and Salvador Salinas, his counterpart here in Texas, that's another federal agency in this case who has high credibility and trust and confidence with private landowners. They've been working together for a long time. So even though Javier could not be on the call today, and I can't speak for him, but I can tell you from a partnership perspective, us joining with NRCS and some of the C&D organizations that exist in this landscape is a real recipe for success. I think we're really poised to finally bring a level of participation, collaboration, and hopefully funding to this landscape that we haven't had for many decades.
This is Debbie. I'm just going to add a real short comment too. I totally agree with you about NRCS, and Javier did get to listen in until just a few minutes ago. But we've been talking to the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, and we're anxious. We're going to be in Artesia in April to the Southeast New Mexico Public Lands Committee that the oil and gas companies have, and talk more about partnerships and money that we can bring to the table. And I guess if we actually could do a habitat conservation plan together with the ranchers and the oil and gas companies in this area, we would, one, have another level of protection, but two, we'd be able to leverage some more money through U.S. Fish and Wildlife that is specifically for this type of thing. And we've got a meeting set up next Monday. But, you know, the more communication, what I'm really excited about is the opportunity to build more new relationships. And, you know, we've done a lot here in New Mexico, but it's primarily been private, state, and federal dollars. There's been some oil and gas money. But I am very excited to have the new partners. And I actually live in Southeast New Mexico, and I have family right there on the Pecos, Black River, that whole area. So very familiar with the area and what we need to do, and very anxious to meet a lot of these new partners face to face.
Hey, Chris, this is Nick with Anadarko. I'd also add in that, you know, the other exciting thing about the effort is, as it relates to partners, is, you know, the door is still open. We still have, you know, opportunities for other partners to join. And so, you know, as I look at the future of this effort, there's still a lot of bandwidth and capacity that can be developed out here to really move the needle.
That's a really good point, Nick. And I think the other part of this is also to, you know, at this point, the partnership and things are being formalized, but it's not a closed door. There are a lot of opportunities, and Ross had a slide up there of all of the nonprofits and other agencies that are working on some of those conservation efforts, and a lot of those are going to be able to be grant recipients under the program too. And I think a lot of the other nonprofit and people, the boots on the ground organizations like the one that Debbie represents, are going to have a great opportunity to be the ones putting these dollars to work in actual conservation projects. There's quite a bit of questions from the audience, so I'm going to jump into a couple of those here right away. And really a lot of them, and this may go to Ross and Myles. You've mentioned a couple pieces of this about how this got started, how long it took to get going, and then some people I think are curious here in the audience about kind of the genesis of this. Was it organically developed, or was there any one feature of it that really drove this to become a reality rather than a bunch of discussions? I'll change maybe to maybe Myles. Do you want to start with that, and Ross can jump in.
If I understand the question, there was definitely a bit of an organic evolution to this initiative, and I've spoke several times about how for Oxy we're building on what we've learned through our approaches to past conservation efforts. But it was really perhaps started with our focus on the Texas hornshell mussel and the challenges of that landscape. That we've got a freshwater mussel that lives in the desert, which is it just amazes me every time I think about it, because it is so far from any what I think of as a sort of environment a mussel would normally inhabit. And we were looking at that Texas hornshell mussel, and at the same time we were looking at the other mussels that have been identified in Texas for potentially being listed, and the importance of those water bodies and the importance of water not only to the mussel but to Texas and this entire region of the country. And when we started thinking about that, we started thinking about the fact that it's not just the water in one discrete location where the mussel happens to be right now. It's an entire system, an entire watershed that we began to realize had to be addressed in some way. And at the same time, the Western governors had embarked on their initiative for ESA and conservation, species conservation, and they were providing opportunities for these types of discussions to take place between parties that may not have generally had these sorts of venues or forums or opportunities to have formal and informal discussions. So while we're trying to address this species, I'm having discussions with people that are thinking about these on even the vaster landscape, for instance, that the sage grouse inhabits. And so by being able to participate and have that forum, we were able to find and understand what NIFWIF could do to assist in the process that we were starting to embark on, which was to look at a larger watershed and understand what opportunities there may be for helping that watershed, and could we learn from that work that we do on that watershed to help other watersheds in Texas and in New Mexico. So that's I think the answer to your question, Chris, there was definitely an organic sort of a lot of organic growth in the discussions that led up to this. It wasn't necessarily one thing, but it was a collection of different efforts, and it was just making those right connections that really helped unlock the opportunity here.
Yeah, this is Ross. I think you've stated it well, Myles, and I think the other thing that was key, and it's really part and parcel of what you're saying, is understanding the connectivity of these landscapes, and the fact that things that are impacting the Texas hornshell in some segment of the Delaware River could be impacted or affected negatively or positively by actions going on, 150, 200 miles away elsewhere in that watershed. So as we start to sort of think about this from a much broader perspective, we begin to understand that, hey, this really is conducive to an ecosystem or landscape level approach, and I think that resonates with partners, landowners and federal agencies, state agencies. I love what the New Mexico Association of Conservation Districts has been able to do on the New Mexico side over the years with funding, and that's encouraging to us to see what we can do across the entire bi-state area here. So the sort of aha moment, I think, for a lot of this was, all right, we understand the connectivity. We got all of these forces on the landscape, and now they're coming together thanks to the efforts of NIFWF to pull us all focused on one particular approach and a multi-species angle to what we do. None of us singly, as an agency, individuals, or a company, can really expect to accomplish as much as we can if we combine our forces. And I'm really excited about the prospects of bringing significant resources to bear on the Pecos watershed here in the next few years. I think we're going to be absolutely astounded ourselves by what we can accomplish by all working together.
Thanks, guys. Going through the questions from the coming in online here, and there's a number of them. I'm going to summarize it into a single question here, and it's around the outreach and the working with private landowners. Ross, you mentioned that Texas is nearly 100% private land, and there's a significant, obviously, private land component, but clearly a working land component as well in New Mexico. But the question is really, what is the strategy for reaching out to private landowners and ranchers in the watershed, and what changes, if any, in land use practices are contemplated to accomplish the goals of the initiative?
Well,
maybe Debbie, Debbie or Ross can start with that?
I can start because what's kept our federal money flowing in the past was doing a lot of on-the-ground tours. We had some interior secretaries, BLM directors, all that kind of thing. So a lot of it is education and doing that kind of thing. And we've already started going ranch to ranch, talking to the landowners individually. And some of the things we see changing is, of course, we're going to have to do some more upland, some more of the brush work like we've been doing, especially right above the river. The riparian work, of course, is going to have to be very important. And so really it's just a holistic thing. We'll work with each landowner to figure out what they need, what they want, in conjunction with working with the Bureau of Land Management and NRCS and all the parties, because it's not just one practice. I mean, sometimes you need to put in fences for better grazing. Sometimes you need to put in watering. There's just a number of practices we're going to be looking at to get the entire thing done. And hopefully most of these landowners will have signed a CCA, and that will help so that we won't have to try to get a biological opinion for every practice we want to do, and that will move us forward much faster. But yeah, definitely we want a lot of pictures, a lot of news articles, just utilize all of our resources that we have to get the word out on the great job that we're going to be doing together. We're excited.
Ross, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, that's exactly my point. And you know, bringing these landowners in early on, working with them, understanding what their needs are. A lot of them are ranchers. There's a lot of recreational property landowners out here too. People who have acquired these properties for hunting and fishing and other recreational pursuits, but understanding what the needs and desires are of individual landowners, and then having a suite of options that we can pull upon to address what's important to them, but also what will bring uplift on the landscape is going to be very important. And you know, Debbie's mentioned a couple of things, but you know, doing things to prevent you know, riverbank erosion, helping to put grass back on the landscape where we've had invasive species move in. I think all of that is going to resonate well with farmers and ranchers and landowners, but it will also have the desired resource benefits that we're looking for. So those are going to be key to getting landowner involvement. Debbie mentioned education and outreach, letting them be part of the decisions that get made out there. And, you know, I think that's all key to a successful implementation.
Nick or Myles, would you like to talk about the role of private landowners from the corporate perspective?
Sure. Happy to do so. Go ahead.
Well, I think, you know, obviously from a corporate perspective, you know, our relationships with private landowners are paramount. So, you know, I see a lot of opportunity to leverage the company resources to facilitate a lot of that interaction with landowners. And I know since we've launched this program, I've had a number of different folks reach out, and so I think there is a lot of opportunity as we move forward with this program to kind of bundle all of this great stuff up together. You know, all the partnerships that we're finding out about already on the ground, a lot of the work has already been done, and then utilizing, you know, the connectivity of all of us to kind of move things in a positive direction.
Well, and this is Myles again. The private landowners are incredibly important out there in the landscape, and really help to drive. The understanding of the private landowner concerns really helped to drive Oxy's approach on this initiative, and will likely drive Oxy's approach on future initiatives. We have landowners that we know would like to implement effective conservation measures on their property. We know them, we've spoken with them, they've approached us. They are still businessmen. They have to be able to realize some sort of return on the investment they make on their property. And so that was where we were asking ourselves, how can we unlock additional funding for this sort of vast rural landscape so that we can continue to provide the incentive for property owners to participate in these conservation measures. And the second aspect of this is also that there is just a significant distrust of federal oversight in West Texas and southeastern New Mexico among the private property owners. They worry that agreeing to some sort of conservation program that's associated with a permit may subject them to some sort of process that might limit their ability to use their property. So we were thinking, how can we be a credible partner with those property owners? How can we unlock this funding so that they are properly incentivized to do those sorts of conservation measures that we think are important on an ecosystem or riparian system like this, and get that money, and give them the return on the property they need, and also address their concern that somehow they're going to be subject to certain permitting requirements that will tie up their property. And so those thoughts were essential in the formative days of this initiative and how we were approaching it and why we were really so receptive to working with NIFWF and others on coming up with or finding a partner that is experienced in coming up with matching funds and reaching out across the table so we can really put some positive conservation on the ground. So those relationships are critical. They help drive our thought process in how to approach this landscape, and they continue to be critical moving forward.
I just want to add to what was just said and agree with you, because Having family that are those landowners, I've had to basically say, you really, really need to sign this CCA, and they really didn't want to. But what has worked in New Mexico, and the reason we've been able to do the large scale, is for every single rancher, we go in and we do what's called a coordinated resource management plan, and not the big thing you're talking about, but basically a plan that talks about what practices we're going to put. But then it also looks at who's going to pay for what and where is this going to be. And so we go in with the knowledge of the different funding from the Bureau of Land Management, NRCS, in this case NIPWIF, and other partners. Our little plan that we do with the ranchers is non-binding. It's not a legal document, but everybody signs it. Everybody that's putting money on that ranch signs it, including the state and federal agencies. And this is what's been successful. And then we have them move forward by going into the NRCS and signing up for EQIP, or in this case, it'll be working with whoever we have helping to get the money on the ground and getting the SNFWIF money. But we have used the retired NRCS people and the retired BLM, and by only having to pay them about $35 an hour and their travel, we are getting a huge amount of work done, and they have that trust, they have the knowledge and experience, and it's not costing a lot, but every landowner has the buy-in with everybody that's working on their ranch ahead of time. So that's critical. So I totally agree.
Great, thanks, Debbie. I'm just going to continue to jump through some of the questions here. Actually, kind of a question that came back that I can probably answer as a moderator a little easier. Talked about our initial request for proposals that went out late last year that is now closed, and will there be subsequent rounds? And then a secondary question there is also what do we look for in terms of specific conservation projects on the ground to accomplish the goals of the initiative? And then a final question about will our business plan be publicly available, and is there sort of some transparency on what we're looking for there? So kind of three questions. I will take the first part of that, which is talking about the kind of the logistics. We did have an initial RFP. We received many proposals, actually significantly more than we were expecting and significantly more than we have had available funding for. But part of that was we rolled this out in November, and all of the partners were very excited about initially getting some work done on the ground and making some of those initial investments and demonstrating work on the ground in 2018. And so we are going to be announcing that first round of grants in March of this year. So within 30 days, those will be announced, and we're excited about those. Maybe, Nick, if I could point this next one to you about what the partners are looking for in terms of looking at projects, and from a going forward perspective, I'll give Nick a minute to get his thoughts together on this. Going forward, we do anticipate we will be having future rounds of this. The companies have made multi-year commitments. There's multi-year commitments from our public partners, and we're continuing to seek additional commitments to ensure that this is not a one-off type of initiative. This is something that's going to take time to realize goals. So we are taking a long view of this, and that means there will be additional opportunities. There's going to be significantly more time available for prospective applicants to apply and interact with the project partners ahead of time so that we can really find those best projects and get them on the ground. But we did have an initial round, and we're really actually quite excited with what's coming down the pike and the level of interest and the diversity of projects that came our way. So, Nick, hopefully I gave you enough time to get some thoughts together. I just kind of put you on the spot there.
Oh, that's fine. As it relates to kind of what we're looking at and how we've come about this initial round, and certainly as I'm concluding, Myles or others jump in, but I think as a group we really wanted to have a demonstrated impact right up front that we could point to and get others excited and enthusiastic about the work that's going on, and hopefully use that to spur additional investment by other oil and gas companies that are operating in this landscape. Whenever we went through this process, we looked at a whole slew of different species, terrestrial, aquatic, habitats, et cetera, and said, as a group, what are some of the focal species that we're most interested in that we can use to really kind of gauge our success? And a lot of those are species that you would expect that are kind of more visible on the landscape, like pronghorn. But there's a number of species that fell off on that list, like desert Massasauga, for example, that aren't as sexy, I guess you might say, from a kind of conservation standpoint. But species that are nonetheless important and have been, being reviewed by Fish and Wildlife Service for potential listing coming up. So looking at where we can have the most impact, and then as a group coming together and ranking the proposals. And I thought it was incredibly impactful that as we all came together with our various rankings for all the proposals, we were very much aligned across industry partners as well as agency partners. And so what we have and what we're going to be putting forward is a suite of projects in this next round, as Chris mentioned, there in about 30 days, that do just what we were hoping, have that impact, have that visibility, and really kind of move the bar in a real special way here at the front of this effort.
There's been an additional question here that's kind of ties back to our business planning effort, which is ongoing. So we're really using these initial requests for proposal rounds and initial investments in getting, as Nick mentioned, getting demonstratable success early on, but we will be developing a detailed business plan that's going to have those specific metrics of what are, not only what can we measure, but what are our goals for the program over time. So initially, a lot of these are based on acres of habitat and specific both at the riparian and grassland perspective. I know there are a couple of questions here about that. I'm happy to have a little bit more detailed offline discussion about that. And actually, to be honest with you, we're taking input as we develop that plan during 2018 on what are some of the best things that we can be measuring. Are we focusing on the right species? And we really do aim to have this be super transparent in terms of our ability to measure these species and our intention of what we're going to work on, and probably just as importantly, what may be outside the scope of some of the initiative. And for example, we haven't taken a great amount of focus on either lesser prairie chicken or the dunes lizard at this point, as those are species that have had significant attention paid to them to date. There's a question, this probably again will be to Ross and Debbie a little bit, but looking, one of the participants said, looking at the photos of the area, looks like one of the issues has got to be the seasonality of stream flow and the effects of that on the watershed. And are there elements that will help assure that the flow of key rivers and tributaries continues during low flow periods and to sustain some of these, particularly the aquatic species? And Ross, I'll kind of tee you up for that one to start.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, definitely. As we think about things that can ensure, the seasonality and the permanence of some of these streams, activities that, as I mentioned, sort of that are taking place outside of the riparian zone can have a huge impact on stream recharge, groundwater recharge, and even, a couple of examples of that is the control of salt cedar along some of these systems, these water-loving invasive species that have moved in, and trying to make sure that we can control those have direct impacts on the amount of water that can eventually work its way down into these streams. And landowners will tell you, many other groups that have worked on this, state agencies, that controlling some of these water-loving species that have really moved onto these landscapes and outcompeted native vegetation. The minute that you cut them back, I mean, you see direct positive impacts on stream flow, water levels in wells for livestock and human consumption. So I think those are some of the things we can do. You know, we're not a water regulatory agency, and you know, but creating more water for everybody to go around, and certainly for the aquatic life that is so dependent upon the seasonality of these stream flows is going to be really important. I mean, a lot of these species are really come about and are dependent on these spring or winter pulses of water flow, stream flows that come around. So making sure that we can maintain that, I think, will be really paramount to making sure that these streams continue to flow and don't get sort of perched or cut off from the main stem of the river.
Yeah, and this is Debbie. Just to add to that, so our main initiative starting several years ago, probably 20 years ago, was basically removing the salt cedar. At that point, we worked with over 400 landowners, but of course a lot of it was north of Carlsbad too. That's one of the biggest things, but also removing these other invasive species on the uplands, because that's going to help keep the water quality better with less soil erosion. The water's going to infiltrate in there. We're going to have better soil health. But we have a big concern right now. We are in a terrible drought in New Mexico, and the flow is going to be a big issue. But we're a little different than Texas in that we do have a regulatory agency, the Interstate Streams Commission, that will regulate the flow as far as anybody being able to irrigate out of there or sell any water out of that area because of the listing of the mussel. So, you know, we've had over 300 partners with this Restore New Mexico. It's going to take a lot of partners to get this done, but one good thing I can say from being a resident down there is in the past, in the droughts we've had, the Blue Springs, which is where the best water quality comes from in that area for this mussel, normally does not decline a lot when we're in a drought, even though the other river systems will. We'll still usually have a pretty stable flow from there. But if we don't get some more moisture, we are really looking at a lot of curtailment of water on the New Mexico side to keep that flow adequate for this species. So it'll be a combination of our voluntary practices, and I'm sure there's going to be some regulatory put in here too. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. Well, looking at the time, we've got assuming 5 or 10 minutes left in this, and I'm going to try to ask one last question and really leave it open to all the panelists to answer this. But I imagine that many of the participants on this webinar are not from West Texas or southeastern New Mexico. And what do you guys see as the transferability of this model to other regions? Obviously, it's just getting going, and it is something that's new to all the participants in the initiative. But really, what do you see as the opportunity for future transferability to other geographies?
This is Debbie. I'll jump in here because we are doing it in other parts of the state. We're working on the Canadian. We're doing some things on the Rio Grande. I think it can work in any state. I've actually went and gave Restore New Mexico presentations all over the West. The critical piece is having that relationship with the landowners, having that credibility, because there is so much mistrust of the federal government in the West, and then having that local delivery system, which is what our soil and water conservation districts have done so well here. And you know, and then of course the partners, everybody chipping in to make sure that you put the money in there that you feel like you're getting a return on your investment, or it's, you know, the funding will not keep going. But it is definitely transferable, and we're excited to show some great early results as soon as we get going on the ground.
Yeah, this is Ross, and I think it is definitely transferable. We're also doing this in other landscapes, but the real, I think, unique aspect of what we're embarking on here in the Pecos is the active involvement of corporate America in helping us to address what is really a problem for all of us. So I think that model, which Myles mentioned this in the work of the prairie chicken, I think having the oil and gas industry and other industries at the table helping to fund and direct these initiatives with a group like the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, who many people in this part of the world aren't familiar with. I really think the sky's the limit here in terms of where we can take this, and the Pecos is going to be really key to basically showing landowners that this can work. It's not just another great idea that has no applicability or no practicality. So we've got a lot of opportunity here to make sure that we get this right, and we're not going to get it right out of the box, and that's the beauty of the adaptive approach here, is we can find what works and tweak that could be made better.
This is Nick. I would just kind of echo some of those comments. I think if this model is transferable, I do think that this effort had a bit of a headwind associated with this particular set of partners and the enthusiasm that was brought to the table given the outlook for this region and its importance from really a corporate standpoint. But I see a lot of success in the initiative's future, and as we deploy our first round of funding and start seeing measurable conservation benefits, and that success, I think, will breed other similar opportunities.
Well, I'll just add on to that. This is Myles. So that was one of the initial attractions to this effort. We do see other imperiled watersheds around the United States. And so we do see the transferability of this effort, and it was one of the things we spoke with NFWF about initially, was that this is an opportunity to maybe not, I wouldn't call it a pilot necessarily, but to put an initiative in place that will help inform other watershed programs. But in addition, and Chris can probably speak to this, NFWF has a long history of working with a single corporate partner on a particular conservation initiative that may be important to that particular corporate partner. What we've done here is a novel approach for NFWF, and that is to bring together a number of different corporate partners. And that, I think, really helps with the durability of the program. It's less dependent on a single partner making a decision whether to stay or go or leave a particular initiative, because as we move forward, and I know I've had discussions with even other companies that are still considering participating in this, I think it gives this program an opportunity to have a durability when you have 6, 8, 10, 12 corporate partners that are contributing funds. That it reduces the risk, the long-term risk that this program will be, excuse my use of the term, but a flash in the pan or something along those lines that will only last 3 years and be gone. I do think it really enhances the durability and reduces that risk of that. So I think it's transferable. I think this model will work on other landscapes in the United States, on other watersheds, and I think that there is an appetite within the corporate partners that I know of on the oil and gas industry to do this type of work.
I'll just add real quick that I am excited about the durability, having worked on projects where, like, we depended on state funding and it only went 3 years, and then we changed, you have an election, and, the same kind of thing can happen with our federal dollars. But, I mean, we have also worked with NFWF in the past, probably the past 10 years. We've had grants specifically working on the prairie chicken area and lizard area. They are a great partner. They do have the ability to, to be able to access federal partners, but I'm also so excited to see so many private corporations coming in that are working down in that area with production. Of course, for New Mexico, that's most of our tax base. A big percentage of our tax base is this production. So we welcome them. We hope we get more partners, and we're just really excited about the whole process. And I love the term durability. I'm going to have to use that. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Debbie. Well, we're right at 11:30, and I really appreciate the panelists. I'm going to turn this back over to Zach for a couple of last pieces of housekeeping, but really thank you for everybody for taking the time today to make this a reality.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and I will just echo that. And first, I'd like to thank our panel. Really appreciate you all taking the time out to share your expertise on this and share your experiences developing this unique program with everyone who could join. And second, thanks to all of those who attended. It was a very active and lively Q&A, so I really appreciate the engagement there. As I mentioned, this was the second webinar in a series that we're planning, the third year for this Species Conservation and ESA initiative. We do plan to do future webinars, and we'll have those dates announced hopefully shortly. In terms of more immediate action, look for a wrap-up email to come either later this week or early next. We did record this webinar, and we'll upload it to YouTube, so that email will have a link to the webinar recording, and we'll also just have a quick one-page summary of some of the key discussion points with some quotes from our panelists. And then finally, I would encourage everyone to go to the Western Governors Association website. We have an online resource library up there that has all of the past webinars that we've done recorded. We have some case studies up there and a whole wealth of information related to the initiative, be it reports from the first and second year, the policy resolution and recommendations that I mentioned earlier. So if folks are new to this and are interested in learning more, I would recommend going to westgov.org and finding the Species Conservation and ESA Initiative page there. And with that, I will wrap up and give a final thanks to everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much, Zach.